This is a lecture about the increased American involvement in Vietnam, the escalation, and the reasons for it, late 1964, early 65. Three developments propelled the United States toward war. The instability of the South Vietnamese government, which we've already discussed. The increasing aggressiveness of the Viet Cong, and the dramatic escalation of North Vietnamese transfers of troops and supplies into South Vietnam. Viet Cong tactics propelled the United States toward war, and it made Johnson angry. Although some American advisors had been killed, their deaths usually occurred in combat operations where the Viet Cong fired at ARVN soldiers and the Americans. Far more common were Viet Cong tricks at American installations where guerrillas infiltrated a military outpost at night and left behind Viet Cong flags or printed messages on the wall, letting the Americans know that they were not safe. Still hoping that the United States would eventually see their side of the war, the Viet Cong had been cautious not to alienate American policymakers by killing United States soldiers. But after the Gulf of Tonkin and the American bombing raids on North Vietnam, Viet Cong tactics changed, and that's what we're going to talk about. Intentional attacks on Americans increased dramatically. On November 1st, 1964, several sampans moved up a stream near the American air base at Bien Hoa and dropped off mortar-carrying guerrillas. They set up several 81mm mortars and shelled the base, killing 4 Americans, wounding 72 more, and destroying or damaging 13 B-57 light bombers. Almost as soon as the attack started, it was over. The Viet Cong got back on the sampans and drifted away downstream. Maxwell Taylor recognized the attack for what it was, a dramatic shift in Viet Cong tactics, which, he believed, had occurred only under the orders of Ho Chi Minh. Taylor cabled Johnson that the attack, quote, is a deliberate act of escalation and a change in the ground rules. It should be met promptly by an appropriate act of reprisal against a DRV target. That means Northern Vietnam target. The ultimate objective should be to convince Hanoi to cease aid to the VC. But Johnson was in a presidential election and voting was just a couple of days away, so he was very careful. He asked William Bundy to draft a policy response. That same day, Bundy offered 3 options to Johnson, including widespread bombing of North Vietnam, but the president ultimately decided to continue the existing policy of tit-for-tat reactions to Viet Cong and North Vietnamese attacks in South Vietnam. Some of Johnson's closest advisors suggested that only a sustained bombing of North Vietnam and Laos could stop the infiltration and demoralize the enemy. George Ball was not one of them. He opposed it. He did not think bombing would break Hanoi's will, and he feared raising the ire of the Soviets or the Chinese. Quote, once on the tiger's back, he said, we cannot be sure of picking the place to dismount. But Ball was a minority of one in the inner circle. Early in January 1965, Maxwell Taylor cabled Johnson from Saigon, quote, we are facing here, let me start over with the quote. We are faced here with a seriously deteriorating situation, characterized by continued political turmoil, irresponsibility, and division within the armed forces, lethargy in the Pacific pacification program, and deepening discouragement and loss of morale. The situation will continue to go downhill towards some form of political collapse unless new elements can be introduced. So what are those new elements? Well, for Taylor, Westmoreland, Rusk, the Bundys, Rostow, and McNamara, the new elements meant massive bombing in North Vietnam and/or a commitment of American troops. Arvin did little to stem the growing power of the Viet Cong, and the United States was not prepared to take over the war. Bombing North Vietnam became increasingly attractive. What stopped Johnson late in 1964 from adopting the proposal for large-scale bombing in North Vietnam was fear about reprisals. If the communists escalated the war, he did not think South Vietnam would be able to handle it. Johnson later recalled, quote, "The political base in the South was probably too shaky to withstand a major assault." When Johnson asked about bombing Viet Cong targets in retaliation for the attack on Bien Hoa, the Joint Chiefs passed the question on to General Westmoreland in Saigon. Westmoreland found himself more in a quandary. For months, he had been requesting the deployment of more aircraft and pilots to his division, the MACV, but now he had to tell General Earl Wheeler that because of heavy jungle cover, the problem of differentiating guerrillas from civilians, and the mobility of the enemy, he could not locate any suitable Viet Cong targets. The Viet Cong was not about to make the president wait long for another opportunity to push the issue. On Christmas Eve in Saigon, a Viet Cong agent drove a car bomb into the basement parking lot of the Brinks Hotel, bachelor quarters for many American officers. The bomb exploded and blew out the entire bottom floor of the hotel, killing 2 Americans and wounding 58. Once again, the president's advisors called for a retaliatory airstrike against North Vietnam, but Johnson overruled them. Such a reaction during Christmas might be misinterpreted at home, and a massive airstrike would be a disproportionately hostile response to the Brinks Hotel incident. Johnson's cautiousness disturbed his advisors, especially Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy. In a memo to the president on January 5, 1965, they wrote that they were utterly certain, quote, that our current policy can lead only to a disastrous defeat. What we are doing now, essentially, is to wait and hope for a stable government, but there is no real hope of success in this area unless and until our own policies and priorities change. They argued that American indecisiveness was undermining the anti-communist effort in South Vietnam. Quote, the Vietnamese see the enormous power of the United States withheld, and they get little sense of firm and active U.S. policy. To bludgeon North Vietnam into submission and to stabilize South Vietnamese politics, the United States should begin a concerted air wave above the 17th parallel, but still Johnson hesitated. Westmoreland's claim that MACV could not locate Viet Cong targets worthy of air attack assumed incredible dimensions on January 2, 1965, when Viet Cong troops destroyed 2 companies of Arvin Rangers and tanks near Bien Gia, a village outside Saigon. More than 200 Arvin troops died in the engagement, and 5 American helicopter pilots were wounded. One American officer, after praising the enemy's fighting abilities, said that, quote, the big question for me is how its troops, 1,000 or more of them, can wander around the countryside so close to Saigon without being discovered. The Viet Cong had the equivalent of 3 full divisions in the field, but MACV operational planners could not pick any bombing targets where they could hurt the guerrillas. 5 weeks later, the Viet Cong struck again, this time at Camp Holloway outside of Pleiku, where the 52nd Combat Aviation Battalion was stationed. In the middle of the night on February 7, 1965, they rained mortar shells on the base and attacked a camp of 180 United States advisors about 4 miles away. In 15 minutes, 7 Americans were dead and another 100 wounded. McGeorge Bundy was in Saigon on a fact-finding mission, and the next day he toured Camp Holloway with Westmoreland and Taylor. Deeply affected by the wounded men, Bundy wanted blood, prompting Westmoreland to think that, like so many civilians in positions of authority, Bundy, quote, smelled a little gunpowder and developed a field marshal psychosis. Still, they urged Johnson to retaliate. Quote, "Old Max really got himself stirred up," Johnson told George Ball. "Those poor wounded boys in the hospital sure as hell got to him." Bundy was not the only person affected. The attack on Pleiku stirred Johnson to action. "They're killing our men while they sleep in the night. I can't ask our American soldiers to continue to fight with one hand tied behind their back." On February 8th, Johnson ordered American aircraft carriers to attack guerrilla bases in Dong Hoi above the 17th parallel, while southern Vietnamese pilots attacked similar sites at Vien Lin and Chap Lai. The airstrike was known as Flaming Dart 1. Johnson also ordered the evacuation of 1,800 United States dependents from South Vietnam. If you take a look just north of Hue, right here is Dong Hoi. 3 days later, the Viet Cong struck again, attacking the Viet Quang Hotel in Quy Nhon, which served as headquarters for the American 104th Maintenance Detachment. While staging a brief firefight, the guerrillas planted 200 pounds of plastic explosives around the foundation of the 4-story hotel. When they were detonated, the building collapsed in rubble, burying 43 American soldiers, only 22 of whom were dug out alive. President Johnson unleashed another airstrike, Flaming Dart 2. Within the next several days, the United States began Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing of North Vietnam that lasted on and off until the end of 1968, when Vice President Hubert Humphrey wrote a memo opposing the raids. The president banned him from Vietnam planning sessions. Johnson's need for consistency and consensus, especially with the situation deteriorating, was becoming an obsession for him. The sustained bombing of North Vietnam had been more than 2 months in the making, and the Viet Cong attack on Pleiku gave the Johnson administration the opportunity to implement the plans. Quote, "To take no action now," Maxwell Taylor argued, "is to accept defeat in the fairly near future." The decision was an important turning point in the war. The tit-for-tat approach was abandoned in favor of a long-term bombing campaign. The United States had just escalated the war. At first, the president kept tight control of the bombing, bragging that the pilots, quote, "can't even bomb an outhouse without my approval." But in the early spring, he relaxed that control, authorized the use of napalm, allowed pilots to drop their bomb loads on alternate targets without prior approval, and increased the frequency of the attacks. In April 1965, American and South Vietnamese pilots flew 3,600 sorties against North Vietnam.